Anybody here brought through the fire? Say amen. Anybody here found joy in the midst of sorrow? Peace in the storm, hope for tomorrow, and seen it time and time again. Just say amen. Oh Lord, I pray to you and I say amen. 'Cause sometimes through the darkness it's hard to see, but just be brave and follow where God leads. 'Cause greater is the one who's in us than he who is in the world. So child of God, remember, the battle is the Lord's. Anybody here? Yes, it is. And we don't have to fight alone if we pray and say amen. Oh, is there anybody here who knows the power of God? Yeah, say amen. Anybody here found joy in the midst of sorrow? Peace in the storm, oh, hope for tomorrow. Seen it time and time again. Just say amen. Even in the valley of the shadow, in the valley of the shadow. Yeah. Say amen. Say amen. Even when the storms are raging, I'm going to say yeah. To say amen. Say amen. There's anybody here who knows the power of God? Say amen. Don't be afraid to wait on, 'cause he is able. Yes, he is. He can do it. Exceeding abundantly above all we could ever ask for. 'Cause he is God. There is anybody who knows that God is joy. The joy of the Lord is our strength. He's the strength of our life. Time and time again, just say amen. Just say amen. Just say amen.
Once again for the invitation. It's been such a blessing and a privilege to be with you tonight, to worship with you, to honor God and see what God is doing in His kingdom. Not just in our organizations, but in His kingdom. So we're just excited to be a part of that, and we're excited to be partnered with you. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate that. Love you guys. You know, it's exciting for me to see a group up front like that with such great God-given talent and young people using that God-given talent to further His kingdom for such a wonderful and honorable thing. You know, and as I look at that group, you know, each person there has a story. Each person there has a story of how God is working in their lives. Each one of us has that too. You know, we serve a great and mighty God, a God that is beyond our comprehension. and a God that, you know, when we look back, and look at all that God has done for us in our lives, or, you know, even on the mountain. Each one of us has a Jumonville story too, right? And, you know, I can think back to, you know, I actually think I did see my younger self without gray hair running around in one of those early shots of that older video. And I think of the way that God worked in my life that summer that I worked at Jumonville. You know, and I think about how He is still active today. And then I'm given great hope and great comfort of all the work that He is yet to do in each one of our lives and through the ministry of Jumonville. We're going to take a bit of a look back now, and look back even further beyond just the last 75 years. And I'm excited to hear. I know pieces of this, but I'm sure there are many things that I'm about to learn. So, Jay, I'll let you take us down the memory lane for back then in Buskin.
Thank you, Jeff. I will add that there was a lady who came to visit at Jumonville this past week who was 87 years old, and she proudly showed me her picture in the Green History book. Those of you who haven't seen it, upon this mountain. So be careful when we take your picture. You never know where it might end up. Most of this is taken from things that are in that book, and this one that was written by Will Hogg, of some of his memories of Jumonville in the early days. So Larry is going to handle the slides, and I will describe them for you. Because this is about the French and Indian War, a disclaimer, I will use the term Indian, and no offense intended, just for historical accuracy. And we're going to talk about the 4 flags that fly over the entranceway, because there were 4 different governments or authorities that controlled the property from the time that it was a vast wilderness until the present day. So think back in time with me to 1754, before electricity, before penicillin, before roads were built through the forest up the mountains. George Washington was 21 years old. He was an experienced surveyor and woodsman, making him valuable to the Braddock campaign. France and England were 2 superpowers fighting over control of the entire Ohio River Valley. They wanted to increase trade with the Indians and move their goods over the mountains. Both sides were on a diplomatic mission, claiming sovereignty and essentially telling the other country to get out of town. Washington's Indian allies, led by the half-king Chief Tennessee, had scouted the area and told him the French were hiding in a ravine a few miles from his camp, waiting to ambush him. Washington, who was 21, believed him, and about 40 men marched all night through a driving rain and surprised the French at breakfast. No one knows who fired the first shot, but in that 15-minute skirmish, Ensign Colin de Jumonville was wounded. As he knelt at the feet of George Washington, Chief Tennessee said, "Thou art not yet dead, my father," and then killed Jumonville and scalped him. This was in revenge for a previous attack by the French on the Indians. That was not how you were supposed to treat a prisoner of war, and Washington won a victory but paid a great cost. One man escaped and walked back to Fort Duquesne to report the action to the French, and this was the spark that started the French and Indian War. A few months later, Jumonville's half-brother came after Washington to avenge his brother's death. That is when the Battle of Fort Necessity happened. Trained in the British style of battle, Washington chose an open meadow to build his Fort of Necessity for a clear view of the approaching troops. Unfortunately, those cowards, the French and Indians, were hiding behind the trees, out of range of the British rifle. It rained for days, the gunpowder was wet, and Washington's men broke into the storehouse and got into the rum. Washington had no choice but to surrender. This allowed the French to keep their weapons and ammunition and permitted the British soldiers to return to Virginia. However, the truce was written in French, which Washington could not read. It was translated to him as Jumonville was killed in action, and he signed it. That's my phone. I'm so sorry.
Can I get it for you?
It's okay. What the truce really said was that Jumonville was assassinated in cold blood. Those papers were sent all over Europe, proving Washington was guilty and sparking the French and Indian War. A British historian said, A volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of Pennsylvania set the world on fire. The following year, Major General Edward Braddock led a road-building mission through the wilderness of Maryland and Pennsylvania. They would fell trees and line them side by side to allow the wagons to go over them rather than sinking in the soft earth in the forest. It was called the Corduroy Road. You know, corduroy, get it? Just short of Fort Duquesne, Braddock collided with an advancing French force at the crossing of the Monongahela. Washington was at Braddock's side when he was mortally wounded and helped organize the retreat to Colonel Thomas Dunbar's camp, which is current-day Jumonville. The tired, wounded army streamed back, and Braddock ordered them to destroy tons of supplies and 150 wagons. This was to keep the French from getting the advantage of free food, ammunition, and transportation. So they burned, buried, or blew up everything they couldn't carry back to Fort Cumberland, Maryland. Braddock died a few days after the battle. They held an Anglican service and buried him in the middle of the road. Then they ran the horses and wagons over the earth to hide its location and keep the Indians from desecrating the body. Thank you, Urban Impact. Have a good trip back. As you may know, his grave was found during road repairs in 1804, and his body was reinterred on a small hill beside the road. In 1913, the great marker was placed to honor his grave. We have many, many artifacts from this day of chaos and destruction. The bullets are made from lead, and they turn white with age. Some are conserved and do not have a change in coloration. Notice these bullets with teeth marks in them. The phrase, "bite the bullet," shows their use as an 18th century anesthetic. Well, perhaps not a painkiller, but a way to keep your teeth from breaking during surgery while you were awake. They did not have anesthesia yet or know about germs, so they would operate on one person, dig the bullet out of their arm, wipe the knife off, and start on the next guy. It was a miracle if you survived surgery back then because of infection. They had not discovered antibiotics yet. These funny-looking guys are called grenadiers. They were the pointmen who scouted the enemy and the route for the army. We have a very rare artifact of the grenadier buckle in our collection. It's the large buckle on the far left in the upper left corner. It actually got cut off a little bit. Sorry about that. But that's very rare to find because they didn't last very long usually. This is one of my favorite pictures. There are 4 pie-shaped coins in the display. Can anyone figure out why they're shaped like that? It's a Spanish silver dollar. And if they needed change, they would break it into quarters. That's where we get quarters from. These tools, wagon parts, and ammunition were part of their abandoned supplies. They were later found when William Graham, a member of the Post 88 of the Grand Army of the Republic of Allegheny, came to visit the orphan school at Jumonville, and he saw the children with things they found in the woods from the battle. He promised to return the next day and give them a nickel for every artifact he would bring them. Little did he know how much was left behind and how industrious those poor orphans were in scouring the hillsides to make pocket money. He nearly went bankrupt, but he kept his word and paid them what he promised. They took the broken cannonballs and had 2 cannons cast from the parts and pieces that were melted down. The orphan school used them when they marched in Veterans Day parades and Independence Day parades. I'm going to have Larry go through several more slides that are artifacts that are on display and some pictures of the museum tours that we offer at Jumonville by appointment. Just too many good ones not to show you some of them.
This one was kind of interesting in the tree right here.
There's a musket ball in that tree.
Stuck in the tree.
Yeah, they found it up in the tree. These are various fragments of bottles and a bullet that's been pounded into a button, a jaw harp. Couple more. Indian tools. and reproductions of a tomahawk. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit now about the orphan school. I believe it was started by a Pennsylvania senator who saw a couple of orphans begging and stealing on the streets. When he found out their fathers were veterans who were killed in the Civil War, he took it up with the legislature, saying their fathers gave their lives for our country, and it was a travesty that their children were starving and turning to crime to survive. The legislature took it under consideration, but a lack of funding and other priorities delayed the effort. Finally, in frustration, he personally paid for a trainload of orphans to go to Harrisburg with him to plead their case before the legislature. They told their stories, and the money was approved to start orphan schools all over Pennsylvania. The school started in Uniontown in 1866 and was later moved to Jumonville in 1875 to remove the children from the evil influences of the city. They had alcohol and morphine addiction back then too. I have learned that aside from God's grace and mercy, human nature doesn't change. We just have different ways of getting into trouble. Once a few boys took a wagon wheel to the top of the knob on a hot summer's day. They rolled it down the hill to see how far it would go. Of all the places it could have bounced or careened off track, can you guess where it landed? Straight for the old stone barn and blew the double doors apart. I can imagine they spent the next couple of weeks learning how to build barn doors. A woman that I interviewed told me that her great Aunt Jenny was a student at the school. She had lost her parents and was being raised by an aunt, and she was a bit of a feisty young lady. One day the superintendent gave her a chore to black his boots. It must have been a dirty job because she refused. She was paddled and then told she could change the sheets on the bed instead. So she made the beds and then went out and gathered thorns and thistles to put between the sheets. She then snuck out of her dorm room at 10 o'clock that evening to hear his reaction. Kids are kids, and they will test you no matter what year it is. The school was run by a Lutheran minister, Reverend Asa Waters, and all the teachers stayed in faculty lodge with he and his wife, where they were always chaperoned. The women were spinsters and never married, because in those days you could not have a career and a family. It wasn't just the social taboo, it would have been impossible to care for a family, making all of your own clothes, raising your own meat and vegetables, canning, preserving food, etc. The school flourished from 1875 to 1908, when the schools closed because their purpose had been fulfilled. The students learned reading, writing, arithmetic, health, and music. In fact, when the Methodists arrived in 1941, they discovered that the flat roof on the schoolhouse, which we call Captain Webb, leaked so badly that they decided to tear it off completely and add a pitched roof. The first floor classroom was a band room for the orphan school, and it had been constructed with the first floor ceiling suspended from the second floor roof, so there wouldn't be any posts or pillars between the conductor and the students. Pretty amazing engineering for the 1800s, I thought. The school was very self-sufficient, growing a lot of their own food. They farmed vegetables and grain and raised chickens and hogs and had an orchard. Each student learned a trade, often by doing their chores, how to repair a wagon or shoe a horse, how to farm, preserve food, bake, or sew. This is what the camp looked like back then. Does anyone recognize this building? Fleming Lodge, that's right, very good. At that time, it had a wooden section on the front that had their bake ovens. You might notice the bricks on the side of the building that look like that. These boys are learning to be surveyors. The children learn to sew their own clothes and preserve the produce that they grew. This was before electricity and refrigeration, so they used cool temperatures underground to preserve their root vegetables for the winter. This was their root cellar, or potato cave. This is where Strum Amphitheater is today. That's where the potato cave was, into the side of the hill. We have a register of the pupils with beautiful handwriting, and we kept wondering why it kept saying Scotland over on the right side, where they would go to Scotland. Well, it was Scotland, Pennsylvania, and there was an industrial school in Scotland where if the boys showed interest and skill, they would send them to essentially the vo-tech of their day when they were 13 or 14. Sometimes a student was transferred or even died from pneumonia or other diseases because they didn't have penicillin or any understanding of how sicknesses were passed on. It was a good year when no one died of the flu or a mysterious illness called consumption. There's a gravestone at Epworth Heights, many of you have seen it, honoring 33 orphans who died during their enrollment at the school. They were required to attend Vespers, a worship service or devotions, twice a day in addition to their schoolwork. There was no such thing as separation of church and state. They wanted those kids to have a moral education, and that's why they were here, to become productive citizens. John Waters grew up here. Can you show them who he is? And later served as a superintendent after his father. This next picture is him when he became the superintendent of the school. And we still have this desk. It no longer has the roll top, but that's the desk I use today. When he was a boy, John stole his mother's diamond wedding ring and carved his initials on the glass of the windows of Anne Murphy Lodge. I imagine when he grew up and became the superintendent, he had a unique insight into meeting children's needs for both love and discipline. This is a beautiful letter by a young boy who wrote home that he was sad and homesick, and he ran away. They found him and returned him to the school, and he says Superintendent John didn't paddle him. Another letter asks for a pair of skates so he could join his playmates. These skates were discovered in the dirt crawl space under the office and a perfectly preserved woolen mitten when they were putting in air conditioning under the office. Some of the fashions they wore were quite different today. Notice those lovely mutton sleeves. You can see the extreme waistline created by the corsets and underskirts. The boys wore dress uniforms for marching in the parades and were issued some military surplus items such as these ammunition boxes as part of their uniform. They practiced physical health and calisthenics. They had sword drills and marches, much like our high school band does today. They ate together in a dining room on these benches with these utensils and plates. They were taught good manners, and the teachers and staff at the school filled the role of both firm and loving parents. They had a nurse to care for them when they were sick, and they even wrote poems about Joe Jackson, who could fix anything. I would add that our maintenance staff would fill that bill very well. Mrs. Waters was described this way on the plaque of Wild Chapel. Where her footsteps fell, there bloomed the flowers of devotion, happiness, and love. It is to their credit that they created such a happy and healthy place for children to grow, learn, and thrive. The children were too poor to buy glass marbles, so they made their own out of clay. You can see the tin toy soldier, the porcelain doll and jaw harp, and they would have been played with to pass the time. Sometimes they would go home for the holidays, and they had examinations to move on to the next grade. They would put on presentations for their parents and visiting dignitaries, memorizing poetry, singing songs, putting on plays and comedies. These are some of the tableaus that they photographed, where they had to stand for 5 minutes while the picture took. They graduated on their 16th birthday because that's when the money ran out. There was no more funding from the state. Often the boys became carpenters or farmers or blacksmiths, and the girls became teachers, seamstresses, or secretaries, and they were able to make a living when they left. Or they went off and got married or returned home to their families. One boy from the industrial school wrote an article, "I am proud I was an orphan." He described his patriotism and pride for his father's service, and how they were taught to look out for the other guy and to take care of themselves. They had a pleasant childhood, being properly cared for, and taught manners and skills for life. He shares at the end how he attended a parade and saw the orphan school band playing his alma mater. He was overcome with emotion at what had been done for him and other veterans' children. He said he could never repay the gift of what had been done for him by the orphan school. They served thousands of students who grew up and would have made their fathers proud. The orphans came back for reunions for decades, even up into the 1980s when Larry and I first came to Jumonville. There weren't any orphans left, but there were still grandchildren who remembered coming to Jumonville with their families for years. And they loved this mountaintop as much as their parents and grandparents had, and as much as you all do. When the school closed in 1908, it was quoted as hoping that another educational institution might be continued on this beautiful spot. The property went through a number of owners and proposed businesses over many years, including the Dunbar Springs Hotel and a Negro training school similar to the Tuskegee Institute, and a possible site for German engineers to conduct glider experiments. I I'm gonna go take care of that and let Larry go.
Harry Wow was a board member of the orphan school and came to own the property. He was a Methodist layman, active in Asbury Methodist Church in Uniontown, where Reverend Will Hogg was the pastor. Will was a visionary and part of a group looking for property to build a place for retreats and summer institutes, a training center for Methodist youth and adults. By this time, the orphan school property was abandoned and in rundown condition. Reverend Hogg and Mr. Wow met to discuss the possibilities. Harry Wow generously agreed to donate the property to the Pittsburgh Conference of the Methodist Church, and he later was convinced to donate his prized rhododendron glen as well for the Green Cathedral area. For the first summer, a dining hall was desperately needed to feed the large number of campers coming for youth institutes. The kitchen in the Barbara Heck building could only serve 150 people, cooking on a coal stove, if you can imagine, for 150 people. President of the board, Earl Patterson, returned from a business trip to Washington and called Reverend Will Hogg and asked that they meet the next morning at Jumonville. Will had a previous commitment, but Earl insisted that they meet. He explained on the way that all new construction would be restricted starting the next day, and the new dining hall must be underway immediately. He had already called an architect to meet him at 10 a.m. and ordered a load of lumber to be delivered that same day, and then stopped at the plumbing store for supplies, which he personally paid for. He told Parley Schaefer, "I'm having lumber delivered today. Get the tractor and go dig a hole so we can be under construction by tomorrow. We'll draw up the plans and deliver them." The next morning, the government ordered all construction not already underway to be stopped. So the dining hall was squeezed in under the wire in 1942. Also, I find this to be an interesting story. Although the wartime building restrictions forbade any new building, it did permit remodeling. The old orphan school wash house, which was now our welcome center and snack shop, was falling apart and was an eyesore on the grounds. Mr. Earl Patterson, an expert in liberal interpretation of government building restrictions, proposed remodeling the laundry. The superintendent of grounds, Barney Schaefer, protested that they could not remodel a building that was falling down. Mr. Patterson explained that he wanted them to tear down the whole thing except for one corner of the foundation, which you can see right there, and remodel it into the snack shop with the same stone in time for the 1943 summer camping season. Their creativity with the rules allowed those two new buildings to be accomplished during the war. There were many different plans for the Jumonville campus in the early years. Note all the groups of cabins at current-day Epworth Heights and Green Cathedral. You see all those clusters of cabins. That was some of the early plans of what they thought Jumonville would be like. And notice the planned location for Wesley Hall in what is now the Bishop's Cabin Field and right by Faculty Lodge. Can you see that there? That was the original site of where they thought Wesley Hall should go. How about this roadway circling the cross at Epworth Heights? You can see it went all the way up, all the way back down, and this part of the roadway sorry. The inn sits right here. So this is a roadway going up there and across the bottom of the field. I don't think anybody looked at any topo maps whenever they decided that's where a road should go. That is quite a steep area there. Reverend Will Hogg first proposed the idea for the Great Cross of Christ on the mountaintop in 1942, where a fire tower had already existed. Anybody remember the old fire tower? Dare to admit it? Jay, not you.
No, I was.
Sarah, you remember the fire tower? Awesome. The original plan was to erect a 30-foot sandstone and masonry cross, and I bet a lot of you didn't know that, and a campaign was begun to raise money by asking every Methodist church in the conference to have their Sunday school children donate dimes for the cross. But before work could begin, a second plan was presented for a larger 40-foot tall cross made of concrete with reinforced steel. Look at the elaborateness of the plans, including an open-air amphitheater right in front of the cross up on top of the hill. That's what part of the original plans. Each donor would have their names written on a list, and we actually have this where they put like little stamps and things when churches would be trying to raise money to reach their goal within that church. And the list was to be placed in the foundation of the Great Cross. However, the wartime restrictions on building materials made that impossible. They would not be defeated, so in 1946, a third plan was approved to bring a giant redwood tree from California to make a great cross on site. However, there was a trucking strike and they couldn't get it here. James McLean of Christ Church in Pittsburgh, a lumber dealer and member of the Jumonville board, had a 60-foot timber cut delivered and erected with the cross arms on Dunbar's knob. So after 5 years and 4 attempts, a cross finally stood on the top of the knob. Then in 1948, Lou Steiner was named chair of the cross committee. He was the owner of the Latrobe Steel Foundry and suggested the idea of a steel cross, a grand 60-foot tall landmark that would be seen for miles. It was unanimously approved that Mr. Steiner graciously and generously offered to have the cross fabricated and delivered as his gift to Jumonville. There were many glitches to solve, including the truck hauling the main shaft getting stuck on a curve and having to bring in a Massey Ferguson tractor to pull them out. Here are some photos of the construction of the cross. And some of you may remember this. That was down on main campus before they started to be able to haul it all up there. So everything was kept down on main campus and then they had to haul it up above. And I love this picture. This picture was actually taken by one of the summer staff who crawled up on top of the crane and took a picture from the top of the crane looking down.
No safety lines.
So when trying to lift the cross into place, the crane's cab began lifting off of the ground, and a second crane had to be brought in. This was before the days of computers, and 2 men coordinated the intense and delicate maneuver to align the cross onto the large bolts in the base. Because remember, this is a concrete base, the bolts were already there. They had to get this giant 60-foot shaft of the cross to be able to line up with those bolts. Anybody recognize those cars? It was dedicated in September 1950, and it was estimated about 6,000 people attended that day. 2 years later, at a Jumonville sponsors dinner, a slideshow by Rich Trimble showed superb pictures of the cross, surrounded by beautiful clouds, magnificent in the sunrise, with hundreds of young people kneeling at the foot of the cross to receive Holy Communion. Mr. Steiner spoke with great emotion, and he said, "Dr. Hogg, when you talked about the cross, I never realized really what was envisioned. I have seen it here tonight, and I want to assume the entire cost of its erection." So he actually paid them for the rest of the money. They never did raise all the money from the Sunday school children. They were still in the process of trying to raise funds to be able to do that. The total figure was about $24,000 and included the foundation, the floodlights, and the resurfacing of the road leading to the mountaintop. And one of the last appraisals that I remember, I think the cross is valued at something like $350,000 if you try to do that now. In an article for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Gilbert Love said, On the grounds of a great war stands a monument to the Prince of Peace. George Washington was known as a man who prayed and depended on God in the harsh conditions of war. And later in the leadership of this great nation, the orphan school leaders hoped for an educational institution to be continued on that beautiful spot. And for the mission of Jumonville to serve children and adults in their spiritual training and growth fits both of those epic visions born on the mountaintop at Jumonville. May God bless Jumonville as we celebrate 75 years of blessings, spiritual awakenings and rebirths, and friendships that have lasted a lifetime. May His provision, protection, and purposes continue to be fulfilled on this holy hill called Jumonville. Anybody learn anything they didn't know before? I continue to learn things all the time, the more research we do, and when you go into the museum and you start looking through some of the different papers. We ran across the blueprints that showed those other plans for up at the cross that I'd not seen before. I actually remember seeing what I believe was a placemat that showed the cabins and things all in a different position and showed Wesley Hall in the field where the bishop's cabins were before the bishop's cabins were there. So obviously a number of those things changed. Bear with me 1 minute here. So tonight what we want to be able to do is talk to you about what our project is. And our project is the 75th anniversary appeal. It just seems like it wasn't that long ago that we did the 50th anniversary with it. I don't know where another 25 years went by, but what does it say in the program how many years this was for the annual on the very front of the program?
75th anniversary.
What is it?
65th.
65th. And I realize that means I've been here now for more than half of them since the sponsors dinners first started. And I know some of you have me beat by a long time, but that was kind of mind-boggling. It's like, wow, I've been here for more than half of the sponsors dinners already. We are looking at, believe it or not, about a $30,000 budget for the 75th anniversary. And what we're hoping to be able to do is some work in the Beatty Museum. A lot of work was done by Wilma Trimble in that museum getting ready for the 50th anniversary with all kind of notebooks in there, but we haven't kept up from the last time we had that for the last 25 years. So we want to be able to redo that. Some of the display things that Wilma put in there are in need of being redone. So we want to do a whole overhaul within that area. And we're going to have some bookshelves built in there to be able to properly show all the different things and gather that information. We also have plans for a new history book. Y'all remember this upon this mountain, and it says Volume 1? When George Schultzenbarger did it, he said, okay, Larry, the deal is every 10 years after should be another volume to do the next decade. Well, we've kind of missed a few in between there, so we're going to do Volume 2 now, but the neat story is the gal who's going to be doing that for us, Sally Shirey, and her husband Bruce have been part of the Braddock Road Preservation Association, are normally here at our sponsors dinner as well, and her grandfather was Lou Steiner. So she's a retired teacher now, and she has agreed to be able to undertake the writing of our Volume 2 of the history book. So that's one of the other things we want to be able to accomplish with the 75th anniversary. We also want to do in the dining hall, where the new restrooms were put on that wall there, we want to do a Dean's Wall of Fame and have pictures of deans who have significantly served at Jumonville for several decades. So we're going to have as many of their photos as possible on that wall. And we're planning major big celebration for the weekend of August the 5th through the 7th for what we're calling the Homecoming Celebration at Jumonville. They got 6,000 people there when they dedicated the cross. Let's see if we can at least get 1,000 people there for the 75th anniversary. We're planning to have lots of different reunion groups meet that day. There's going to be lots of activities going on throughout the whole day. Bill Jacka, Bill, stand up, and Lisa, the two of you stand up. They're the co-chairs of our 75th anniversary committee and have been very hard at work making plans for that day. So you'll be hearing more about that. But there's a lot of things that we would like to do, part of it depending on the amount of money that we're able to be able to raise for that day, because you don't have those things happen very often. So we'd really like it to be a special day at Jumonville. So we would ask you to prayerfully consider what your gift might be able to be for that project. And if you can't do that tonight, if you want to make a pledge to Jumonville, the envelopes are on the table. If you'll fill those out and then just put those back in the envelope. We can take credit cards if you have stock you want to sell. If you've got a really nice sports car you want to give to us at Jumonville, we can liquidate that. If you've got a house that you want to give to us, we'll take whatever you've got that you're willing to be able to share. Thank you so much for your wonderful support for Jumonville. And now we're going to have our song, Thanks for Jumonville, as we start to wrap up our evening. Thank you so much for your wonderful support. Yeah, you have the words on it. Yep. Oh, you're going to do it.
So a couple of things. First, before you go tonight, I'd like you to come up front to the table that we've got set off to the side over here. We have our first release of some 75th anniversary items up here. We have shirts and there are also calendars as well. So if you would please come up and take a look, I would appreciate that. The second thing is I had David Catley help me out. He gave me a number, and appropriately he chose number 75.
Oh, nice.
And this is just a little giveaway that we have here, and this is a 50th, one of the 50th anniversary Jumonville plates. And number 75 is Lynn Hartstein. Woohoo!
There you go.
So thank you all for being here tonight. A very exciting time for us as we launch into our year-long celebration of all that God has done on this mountain and all that God is going to do on this mountain. It has had a huge impact on my life. You know, I look around this room and I see people here who met on that